Our message for this morning comes from chapter 5, a lesson from the monks. And I think it is interesting that Richard Rohr is a Franciscan monk when he really doesn't like Western religion very much. And I think that comes through loud and clear here. Do not plunder the mystery with concepts. The Zen masters. My religion is kindness. That's from Dalai Lama. What is the goal of religion? What do they equip us to learn, to see, or become? As I study the history and the teachings of the world's religions, I am deeply struck by one overwhelming difference. In native religions and in the religions of the East, one consistently finds the goal to be harmony, the overcoming of distinctions, conflicts, and oppositional energy by various conversions of the mind, the heart, the emotions, the body, the will. They tend to be less concerned about metaphysics than we are, and also less concerned about the next world. Most ancient teachings, including those of Jesus and the Desert Fathers and Mothers, as well as aphorisms, riddles, stories, wisdom sayings, and concrete practices, revealed the small self to the person and opened her up to some form of the divine self. I'll say that once more. Most ancient teachings revealed the small self to the person and opened her up to some form of the divine self. These wise teachings invariably sought to create balance both within and without. The emphasis was on spiritual practice and on practices much more than on believing cerebral ideas to be true or false. They didn't worry about sin management the way we Western clergy did. Their concern was usually to seek some kind of equilibrium, inner harmony, or peace, which took many different forms and emphases. And in general, they thought that brought balance, one to divine union more than to moral perfection, which I also really love that. They thought balance brought one to divine union more than moral perfection did. It is very hard for Westerners to make that switch. For some reason, monotheistic religions think that deciding who is going where and why, and for Catholics when, is our business. Perhaps we think it's the only way to have some control over people or society or the future. Muslims are damning Christians to hell. Christians are telling Jews they are not saved. And Jews, for example, spat at me while I joined them praying at the Wailing Wall, wearing my Franciscan habit. How did we ever come to this in the name of a loving God? The monotheistic religions emerged in the West and largely took on the organizational model and the verbal debate forms of the West. In our style of debate, you either win or lose, you make points or you lose points. Religiously, you are either saved or not, in or out of grace. We like clarity and we like strong identity. Native and Eastern people had teachers and wise people as well, but there didn't tend to be a centralized control over the message, the book, the role, or the office. The people went to medicine men, shamans, hermits, enlightened ones, the gurus. They participated in the ceremonies, the temples, the rituals, and in my opinion, produced at least as high a rate of transformed people as the West did. When I travel, I surely see as many of the gifts of the Spirit among non-Christians as Christians, and often more. In fact, much of the world's temples see a continual flow of people all day, every day, whereas many of ours are closed except for Sunday or Sabbath services. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have not been known for creating harmonizing people. In general, peacemaking, nonviolence, love for the outsider or the poor, humility, and dialogue have never been the strengths of these religions, even though many people in each group attained a higher level of transformation. Our concern was usually group order, consistency, organization, and clarifying and enforcing membership requirements. Not all bad, but not all good either, because we lost some essential values that the harmony-based religions preserved. The fact that I love this part. The fact that the two great wars emerged in a Christian Europe filled with churches and theology schools needs to be examined. The fact that racism, profound social inequity, and anti-Semitism were not broadly recognized as serious problems until almost 2,000 years after Jesus is forever a judgment on the immaturity of Western Christianity, whether Catholic or Protestant. Communism often emerged in formerly Christian cultures where social injustice had not been addressed in any serious way, China being the major exception. The former colonies of Latin America have never known even minimal social justice since their inception, despite their Catholic identity. The genocide of American Indians and the enslavement of Black Africans seems not to have been a problem for North American Protestants. Sexism didn't even begin to be seriously faced until the 1950s, and its remedies are still ignored and even resisted by most patriarchal churches and our current patriarchal government. No asides here. Elitism, classism, torture, homophobia, poverty, and the degradation of the earth are still largely unaddressed by the believers. Such issues don't count in most salvation theories. I list all of these not to be negative, but to let us see the very real limitations of over-defining and over-asserting the individual self and its private salvation, and the expansion of that false self into ideas such as my Christian country. The individual becomes individuated in the West without any keen awareness of the common good or the harmonizing of body, mind, heart, and I think this last one, and community. The highly individuated personality colonized the world and spread its conquering version of Christianity. Catholic means universal. Yet in my experience, most Roman and Anglican Catholics and most Orthodox are much more provincial and ethnic than truly universal. And most Protestants are still protesting too much, rather than transforming themselves and their cultures. In both individualistic groups, there's never been much concern for social sin or institutional evil. Spirituality lost out, and now so many of our people go elsewhere to find what they seek: support groups, conferences, books, or do-it-yourself plans. According to a recent national study, 44% of Americans today are somewhere else than in the church of their upbringing. The second biggest denomination after Roman Catholics is former Roman Catholics. That includes how many people in this room. Go the hands. Has this ever happened before in history? One wonders if a civilization can flourish when so many of its people are so alienated from their own traditions and religions. So here, he says, is a debate everyone can win. This is a true story, and it illustrates what others have to teach us. Perhaps it can invite us Westerners out of our left brains and into the other hemisphere. A friend of mine, Thomas Williams, once brought back a stack of photos from a monastery that he visited in Tibet. Older and younger monks were pictured in what was called in our translation the consequentialist debate. In every photo, there's a young monk seated on the ground and an older one seemingly circling around him. And many of the pictures, one or both of them was smiling and gesturing. Thomas told me that during the young novice's training, he or she is presented over a period of 3 years with each and every one of the Buddha's teachings. And during that time, she has to name all of the difficult and problematic consequences that would follow from observing that teaching. After each answer, the older monks clap their hands in approval and they smile at one another. When all of the possible negative consequences are exhausted, they move on to the good consequences. And once those have been unpacked, it doesn't matter how many days or hours it takes, the masters clap their hands and they smile at each other. It appears to be patient and disciplined in non-polarity thinking and in broader reflection and discrimination. There is no declaration of the perfect answer. There's no declaration of the wrong answer. The novice is simply being taught how to weigh and discern, see and understand the good and bad consequences. What an utterly different structure compared to a Western debate style, where one must win and the other must lose. And that has become our style of religion, too. Here's the clincher. The only way you can lose the consequentialist debate is to stop smiling. Obviously, this calls for letting go of the ego. Have you ever noticed that in any situation when your ego is invested or afraid or needy, it's very hard to smile. But when the truth is not your personal possession, it's very easy to smile. The concern in Tibetan Buddhism is not to achieve a conceptually perfect answer, which then has to be defended. Rather, but to call forth a happy, loving, aware, and perceptive human being. And isn't that a type of salvation? The impulse behind this worldview is reflected in the wider society. Tibet is one of the very few wisdom-based cultures left in the world, and despite enormous pressures, it has never been warlike or aggressive. Jesus would probably feel at home. Many of us have heard Dr. Phil, the TV therapist, tell couples in counseling that sooner or later, every married person has to decide, do I want to be right or do I want to be happy? He says he is saddened and surprised at how many prefer to be right and therefore are seldom happy. And then he adds to their shock with his signature question, how is that working for you? And at this point in human and Western history, we have to ask the same question. Christianity, how is that working for you? Remember, Jesus never said, this is my commandment, thou shalt be right. It's an amazing arrogance that allows Christians to so readily believe that their mental understanding of things is anywhere close to that of Jesus. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I think the intended effect of that often misused line is this. If Jesus is the truth, then you probably aren't. We don't have a lot of time for that, but I would like to know what you're reflecting on. There was a lot